Welcome back to Red Cedar Radar. I'm Sydney, the host today. Brad, my usual co-host, is out. He will be back soon, but he's out for now. So I have brought on Paul Fanson with me again today. He was on, 2 weeks ago?
I believe it was 2 weeks ago, yes.
Yep. Talking about, looking ahead to the Big Ten tournament at that point, and now we're looking ahead to March Madness. So Paul is joining me today to kind of give an analysis of the big dance and where MSU stands and kind of looking ahead at the tournament as a whole. How are you today, Paul?
I'm doing good. This is very much my favorite time of year, so much so that basically, and I'm not making this up, every Thursday and Friday, the first weekend of the NCAA tournament, I have taken days off of work for my entire professional career, which spans over 20 years now. So I take this stuff very seriously, and I do think about it a lot, and I put a lot of thought into it. I have now started a new tradition of also taking the Monday after Selection Sunday off, which I did today, and I spent that time crunching a bunch of numbers. Hopefully came to some interesting conclusions that I'd be happy to share with all of you today. So I'm looking forward to it.
I love that. Something we all aspire to do, take days off and watch basketball. So
yes,
before we get in, sorry, Paul, I didn't mean to cut you off. Before we get into talking March Madness, I wanted to bring up just a couple recent things, recent MSU news. First of all, MSU hockey is unfortunately done for the season. They lost at Minnesota. I didn't follow it very seriously. I follow Brad and his tweets and what he has to say about MSU hockey. And since he's not here, I'm sure we'll talk about, recap the season as a whole once he's back. Disappointing that they lost, but also looking at the bigger picture of how their season went, I think there's so much room for growth, and I'm excited to see Adam Nightingale continue to kind of lead them in that right direction. So this is a stepping stone of, better years to come. Anything, are you a hockey fan at all, Paul? I don't know that about you.
I am a bit, and actually I'm from an era of back when, because I was at MSU from basically the late 90s, which was I was actually there for Judd's last year and Coach Izzo's first three, so that was an exciting time to be a student. But back then, actually, hockey was the big revenue sport on campus, and I think even Coach Izzo's been quoted of saying that it was MSU was a hockey school back then, which basically was true. And so I actually had season tickets all 4 years to hockey, as well as basketball and football. And the hockey tickets were actually the hardest to get. They had a lottery for the student tickets, and I actually never had a seat to watch a Michigan State hockey game the entire time I was a student. I went to one game standing room only.
Okay.
So those were good times. And so the current kind of slump that we've seen in East Lansing with the hockey program is it's actually quite sad, because the hockey, I mean, Munn Ice Arena was rocking back in the day. There were some special sports memories in that building. And so it's good to see them kind of a little bit more on the upswing. Hopefully that will continue. Nightingale looks like he may have made the right choice, but I thought the same thing about Dan Cole, at least for a little while. So but I'm encouraged with the direction of the program. It looks like they're not going to make the NCAA tournament, but the fact that they were in the conversation this late in the season, I think, was encouraging.
Yeah, definitely. I think they had, and I don't know the exact number, but at the end of the season when they were still playing the Big Ten regular season, they had a bunch of sold out crowds at home, which it hasn't been that way at all. Not mostly at all the time that I have been a student there. Things have been pretty dead, so that was exciting. Like I said, Brad will be back next week, and I'm sure he'll give kind of a more in-depth recap of that whole season. Yeah. Other thing I wanted to mention was breaking news today. Head MSU women's basketball coach Susie Merchant has parted ways from Michigan State. She's battled some health concerns, issues over the latter part of the women's season. The women just recently decided to decline their invitation to the NIT, just kind of stating the adversity that they've faced at the end of the season, which they have gone through a lot. I got to attend a couple women's basketball games recently with my family and then covering a game. And it was weird to not see Susie on the sidelines, because she has been, as long as I've been a Michigan State fan, she's been, what I think of when I think of MSU women's basketball. here's a story. I used to want to be Susie Merchant so bad because of how low that she could squat in her heels on the sidelines. She was my idol for that. I just thought she's so strong. She's so amazing. She can squat in those, giant heels, high heels, and her hair always looks so perfect. I was always a big fan of her. So I am sad to see her go, but I think she's had some, difficulties that she's been facing recently. So maybe it's the best choice for her and her health. Any Susie Merchant memories, Paul?
Not as many. I have been to a handful of women's games over the years. The women's team was pretty weak back when I was a student. But actually, there was maybe the beginning of her current kind of run of some health issues. That there was a game maybe 5 or 6 years ago where she basically fainted on the sideline, and I actually attended that game. We had just gone with the family as kind of a fun event, and I had quite small children at the time, so I was mostly like chasing them around, and so I didn't actually see her go down. But it was a pretty scary time. So I think it's good that she's taking her health seriously. The fact that she did have, I don't want to call it a recurrence, but whatever it was, seems to not be fully resolved. And I think I believe it probably is best for the program and for her to take a step back. But I think that she was an excellent kind of shepherd of the program, so to speak, over the last few years. I know McCall, I believe, was the coach before her that even took the women's team to the Final Four in 2005. I believe actually it was 2005, and I think taking over for her was difficult because that coach went directly to Duke. For those that remember that, but I think that the program will continue to go on. I think they've had some bad luck the last few years. They haven't made the tournament in a few years. I don't know. I don't recall exactly how many, but I think they'll be able to turn it around, and it's probably time for a fresh start.
Yeah, yeah. I think for everyone involved, maybe it's time,
Yep.
to make those decisions. Yeah, I was sad to see her go, but these things happen, and I hope that she gets the time that she needs to heal, and maybe we'll see her on the sidelines, somewhere else in the future. I know that she has some maybe middle school age kids too, so, it's important for them to have their mom
Absolutely.
during those years and everything too. So, yeah. Okay, so those are my kind of two updates. Also, I saw that Michigan, they released the NIT bracket once, and then whoever the committee for that is said, oh, accidentally released something wrong. Michigan is not, what was it? They're not a 2 seed, they're actually a 3 seed.
Yes, I believe that's true. To the extent that matters in the NIT.
Yeah, right. Well, just kind of funny altogether, but we won't talk about them too much because, they're not going to be in your conversation that we're going to hold here in a second.
They're not. I didn't hear their name called yesterday.
No, you know what? And I even rewinded the whole thing to be like, oh, I missed the Wolverines. I didn't see them. Nah,
No, we don't have to rewind. They're not there.
Okay, so you have some things prepared to talk about March Madness, but before we get kind of into the big tournament, I wanted to recap a little bit with you about the loss to Ohio State in the Big Ten tournament. I was there. I traveled to Chicago. It hurt my heart. I mean, brutal to be there. But from your side of things, what does that do as far as like leading into the Big Ten tournament? Leading into the big March Madness tournament. Sorry.
I mean, it's hard to say. I was pretty frustrated after that loss. It kind of shook my faith in this team a bit. I've been sort of low-level overconfident that this team's going to go on a run, because I think there's a lot of good elements there, and I think it's kind of time for a Tom Izzo run, basically. And things started to look like they were headed in a good direction. I mean, yeah, of course, there was a loss at Iowa, and that was kind of stupid. But, in general, the team was looking pretty good. Honestly, even before the game started, I didn't want to see Ohio State again. I just, the old adage of you don't want to have to beat a team 3 times is true. And I think that they were definitely starting to play better. And I just felt it was a very lackluster performance from the Spartans. I think they started the first half okay, and they started the second half okay, and they just didn't have the energy or the fire that they needed. And the worst part was, and I think I tweeted something about this, that I felt like Ohio State was starting to tire, like even in the latter stages of the first half. Like, not all the shots, clearly, because they hit a whole bunch of threes, but like a lot of their shots started coming up short. And I felt like they were trying to collapse, and the Spartans just wouldn't let them. They're like, no,
Yeah.
we'll instead of getting a basket and tying it, we'll like miss a layup, and then we'll like kick the ball out of bounds, and like we'll have a guy fall down. You know, it's just, it was disheartening. I don't think it necessarily impacts what they'll do this weekend. I hope it doesn't, but my faith is a little bit shaken. I would be lying if I said it wasn't. So hopefully this is a learning experience.
For sure.
I think that, you know, the team sort of goes as AJ Hoggard goes, and he didn't really have a great game. So if we can get him locked back in and get the team playing a little better defense, then they'll be okay. But I don't know.
Something that I've said this whole basketball season on the podcast and just like in general is, I thought that at the beginning of the season and glimpses throughout that AJ Hoggard showed a lot of like growth, and you know, he was really playing like a leader on the team. But there's so many times that I see some immaturity from him that just is like so blatantly obvious that I don't know how he can get past it other than like completely growing up and getting over some of those habits. And I don't know how that hasn't been addressed. It probably has been addressed by Izzo, you know. But I see flashes of someone that he could be, and then in those big games when we need him to be the leader, he's just not that person. And I don't know what the deal is with that. But there's been some times that I've just been completely unimpressed, and other times that I'm like, why was I ever unimpressed before? You're amazing, AJ. He kind of flows up and down for me, and I don't get it.
Yeah, it's very inconsistent. I would agree.
Yeah. So I was at the game, and what you said about like Ohio State trying to give it up, there was tons of times where like there was way more MSU fans there than there was Ohio State fans, which is crazy. But Ohio State fans were probably like, they're not going to win, so why do we go? But
they're waiting for football season.
Yeah, right. There was tons of times that all of us stood up and like everyone was clapping, and it was getting really loud in there as we, you know, cut the lead. And then we'd all sit back down like, okay, well, wait it out. You know, they didn't quite get there. And then everyone would stand up and clap, and we'd be so close, and everyone on the bench, you know, would be woo, you know, and then they wouldn't ever get it done. It was like, you know, up and down, and they just quite couldn't get it going.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
The other thing that was I would say concerning but notable is Malik Hall had a real stinker.
Was he even there? Yeah.
He just wasn't locked in, and I don't. There was some comment that maybe he had back spasms a week or so ago, and I'm hoping that's not carrying over, because the team can't really reach their potential without at least the kind of, you know, at least the B minus version of Malik. I think we'd like to see the A minus version. That would be great, because he's really valuable when he's you know, kind of, you know, at his potential. But I feel like we haven't seen that in a bit, and that's concerning. I hope he can turn it around.
Yeah, it just seemed like as he would come in, sometimes he brings the energy, and like he makes a big play, and that turns things around. And even if he isn't continuing to make big plays after that, he kind of changes the tide for the team. He just kind of came in, and it was like, you know, 3 minutes went by. Oh, Malik's out there. I didn't even notice. Whereas usually that's not how his presence is felt on the court. Yeah, I kind of noticed that multiple times throughout the game. We went back and watched the 2 games on Saturday just because we were in Chicago, just for funsies, because we like basketball. And we were sitting by some Purdue fans, of course. They're watching Purdue's first game and then stuck around to cheer for Penn State, you know. And one of the guys that was sitting behind us tapped me on the shoulder and was asking me about, you know, first of all, how I felt about the Iowa game, and I gave him my 2 cents about that. And then he was talking about how he was not expecting Ohio State to win, and, you know, I was telling him, like, it didn't even seem like our team really got off the bus, and he was hoping that they could have a matchup with us. But since we saw the seeding for the March Madness tournament, it's maybe possible that we could have another matchup. What do you think about that?
We are in the same region. I mean, it's unlikely. That would be. I don't want to even say that would be fun. I don't think it would be fun. I don't like the idea of playing Big Ten teams in the NCAA tournament. It's It's sort of like been there, done that. Of course, they would
Mm-hmm.
have to beat us 3 times, which that could be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't honestly think Purdue's going to make it that far,
Yeah.
but we'll see. I have
Yeah.
thoughts on Purdue. They're gonna do Purdue things probably because that's what Purdue does. Um, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it's
Okay, and
certainly
then I'll
possible.
save my questions about
Okay.
Purdue specifically because after watching them, it was very nice to watch some basketball games in person and be
Hmm.
like completely unbiased.
Yeah.
Because then you can really look at the other team's players. You know, when they're playing MSU, I'm always, oh, he's terrible, he's no bad, and he's not that good. But watching them and like watching their different schemes and stuff, it gave me a new perspective on some of those teams. So we can talk about that later.
Okay.
What
All
would
right.
you like to start with as far as bracketology, Paul?
Well, I'll start with just the art and science of bracketology itself.
Perfect.
Because as I say, this is a thing that I've studied, I guess I'll put in air quotes,
Mm-hmm.
for a good part of my adult life, and I feel like I've gotten a pretty good understanding of kind of how the process works, and I've actually for several years done my own sort of bracketology exercise, which tells you a lot about sort of how it's done. So, as one of the many sports-related spreadsheets that I have one that tracks the various statistics that the committee says that they value. So things like, net rankings and Ken Palm rankings and, quad one wins and, strength of schedule and stuff like that. And went through the exercise of sort of creating my own seed list and then seeding the tournament. Um, which if you try it, you do gain a lot of insight into the process because there's a lot of constraints that I think maybe people don't realize because there used to be what they would just call they call it the S curve, where you set the tournament up to try to pair the best teams with the weakest teams all the way through.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, like the best number one seed is supposed to get the weakest number two seed and, things like that. But they don't actually do that because one of the other major things that they do is they try to keep teams as close to home as possible. So there's actually a pretty big geographic component, which the committee did some weird stuff this year, which I'll get into. But so that's a constraint. And then they also they've softened this up a little bit, which I find annoying, is they try to keep teams from the same conference away from each other as much as possible. So,
Mm-hmm.
like Michigan State and Purdue,
Right.
unless there's a whole bunch of teams, they shouldn't be able to meet until the regional final. And so
Yeah.
that actually puts quite a bit of constraints in the process to where you can sort of pick like the first 8 or 10 teams and sort of seed them in, and then after that it's just the 4 seeds. It's almost like process of elimination. Like they sort of have to go this spot, this spot, this spot, or it doesn't. You violate one of those seeding principles. And so that's just kind of a fun exercise for me. I actually
Yeah.
reseeded the tournament several times over the weekend. And spoiler alert, it's not actually that difficult. So when I hear like things like the selection committee, I've heard rumors that like, well, the selection committee, they've got the first 10 seeds all slotted on Saturday afternoon. And I'm like, but why?
Yeah.
Because it's not that hard to fix it. Like it
Yeah.
took me like half an hour. Like it's not that hard. So that always drives me a little bit bonkers. Um, but I did go through and do my bracketology exercise and just checking my cheat sheet here. I got all the teams right but 2. So as far as the teams, the first teams out, first teams in, the last teams out, what have you. I had Rutgers in, as I think any sane person did.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had Oklahoma State in, which was the last team in based on the what the committee said. And they didn't get a lot of discussion about sort of the why. I think everyone kind of focused on Rutgers, and that's fine. But the 2 teams that they did put in, which I have a bit of a beef with, is actually the 2 ACC teams. So I saw
Okay.
NC State go in as like an 11, like not even in the first 4, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like their resume was not good. Like they have exactly 1 quad 1 win, and
Mm.
we've said that that's important. I've been told that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um, that's not good enough. And then they put Pittsburgh in too. Like Pittsburgh looks worse
Mm-hmm.
than NC State. Like
Yeah.
I don't know what they're thinking. And well, actually, I do know what they're thinking. They see those 3 letters associated with them, the A, C, and C, and they think that because they're in the ACC, then well, that you can't only put 2 or 3 ACC teams in. We got to have more than that, right? So I think it's as simple as that. I mean, I think you put I don't know, West Virginia, and you put West Virginia's name on NC State's resume, they're not in the tournament. I would almost
Mm-hmm.
guarantee you that. Um, So I thought that was annoying. And like Oklahoma State, um, people seem less upset with that, but I mean, they had like, um, how many quad ones did they had a whole bunch of quad one wins, and they had like a top 10 strength of schedule, which again, we've been told other years, oh, you got to have a good strength of schedule, right? Well, apparently not this year, because yeah, they had 6 quad one wins, um, three bad losses outside of quad win, quad one. They had
Hmm.
15 total losses, but I mean, the Big 12 was really good. So
Can I ask a question about that?
sure.
So, as a coach, you're looking at the resumes of your team versus the team that got in.
Hmm.
Are they allowed to like reach out and ask, what was the process? Why didn't we get in? Or is it just a kind of like, we're the committee, obviously what is said is done. You can't change it now, but like,
Yeah.
can they ask, can they inquire about that? Or is it just kind of like a done, closed conversation?
I think it's basically a closed conversation.
Hmm.
I don't have any insight into exactly how those inner workings might go down. I
Yeah.
mean, certainly on some of the shows, either on ESPN or CBS, they'll talk to the committee, and um,
Hmm.
I didn't actually watch the ESPN show yet. The CBS one, they didn't have a lot of that. They had very kind of stock responses. There's been a couple years where like Dick Vitale has like teed off on the
Hmm.
committee chair, and I think maybe they don't give
Yeah.
interviews so much anymore. Um, but
That's,
no, I don't know if they can really lodge their complaint. And
yeah.
the funny thing is that like I try to use a lot of math to try to predict what a bunch of human beings decide in a committee, and like
Hmm. Hmm.
that's not really possible. So
Yeah. This is a question I maybe should know the answer to, but how is the committee decided? Who are those people and
hmm.
where do they come from?
I think they're largely athletic directors
Okay.
from that's kind of balanced between like big and small conferences, big and small schools, and it's somewhat geographically distributed across the United States. Um, I'd have to look up how many people are on it. You may remember that in 2016, Mark Hollis, the MSU's athletic director, was the chairman, so he was actually on the committee for several years. I forget the current chairman where he is from. I remember them saying on the broadcast he's a former player, though, which I thought that was at least interesting. He should know better. Um, but other than that, I'm not certain the makeup, like how many. It's probably 8 or 10 people. I should know that, but I don't.
Yeah. It's always just always very mysterious, the committee.
Yeah,
Who are these people? Where do they
yeah,
come from? But yeah. Okay, continue. Sorry, those are my off the wall questions.
no problem. And so yeah, a lot of people are upset about Rutgers, and I understand. I mean, granted, they kind of faded down the stretch. Um, but they had apparently I think it was 3 or 4 quad 3 losses, which kind of punished them. Which again they all talk about quad 1 wins, not how many quad 3 losses do you have? But they had 4, but some of them were like borderline quad 2. So the committee is supposed to know better than that. But I mean I guess some could argue that Rutgers sort of got what was coming to them for not rescheduling their Minnesota game. But you know that's true. I'm not losing any sleep over that particular incident, but I guess it is what it is. So I guess Rutgers is a 1 seed in the NIT, so good for them. Um, and then the some of the other stuff that I think is interesting in looking at this bracket in particular is that there's a lot of, I don't want to call them mid majors, but there's a lot of teams kind of sprinkled through the bracket that I think are really hard to evaluate how good they actually are. Um,
Yeah.
and so in particular, the Mountain West, I think had 3 or 4 teams. I think 4. They had San Diego State, Boise State, Utah State, and um, one other. I thought there was one more, but they have at least 3 teams. Nevada, that's the 4th team, who was the last team in, who I also had as the last team in. And it was difficult to seed those teams, and I think it's going to be also difficult to predict how they're going to do. We also have St. Mary's that plays in Gonzaga's league, the West Coast Conference. They've had kind of ridiculously strong metrics all year. Like, on some level, I could have justified putting them up. Like, well, I think they wound up as a 5 seed if I remember correctly, but I could have even justified putting them on a 3 based on their metrics. But I knew that was crazy, so I didn't do it. And then there's teams like Florida Atlantic, who also had very strong metrics. They're out of the Conference USA, and it was really hard to place them. I kind of put them on the 8-9 line as everyone else did. I think just kind of by default. It's a good spot for a team you don't really know what to do with because maybe they're good. They can win some games. Maybe they can give a 1 seed a scare, but they don't, saddle another team with that spot. Maybe so. Maybe that's okay. So those were tough teams to seed.
Something that I was wondering, because like I noticed that too. There was a lot of teams that I was like, I don't know a single thing about them. Or they were saying, oh, this is their first time in the tournament. This is their, they said one team, I don't remember who it was, and I should have, but I think this is their first winning season in program history. And I was like, what? That's crazy. But I was wondering, like, maybe I'm used to hearing names like Michigan, Texas Tech, like some of those places that fill spots that I know of more. And maybe not Texas Tech always. I don't know much about their program. But, like, that's a name that I know. And when I hear it on the, Selection Sunday, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. But a lot of those teams, or some of those teams, had bad, uncharacteristically bad years. And so then some of these other schools got in instead. Is that kind of why I was noticing that, or is it just kind of how I don't know.
It's probably a combination of a few things.
Yeah.
No, I think I know what you mean. If I remember correctly, the team that had never made it is it Kennesaw State, if that's the correct pronunciation? If I'm looking at my bracket right.
Are they like yellow and black?
And I don't know. It's
you don't,
possible.
You don't know the color schemes of each team on the bracket?
I don't know the mascots either. I might have that in a spreadsheet somewhere, and I'm not.
It's okay.
Joking.
I just remember seeing them, like, they went live, a live look at their, gym or whatever.
Yeah, and so for those schools, like a lot of the schools that have never made it, they're from smaller leagues that they won their conference tournament. Right. So they make it for the first time. I think there was kind of a vacuum where, you had teams like North Carolina that, started the season, preseason number 1, didn't make it. You had Michigan that didn't make it. Wisconsin didn't make it. So you had several teams that have been in the tournament, quite a bit recently that didn't make it. And then honestly, like the ACC that I was dogging on before, I mean, they had a weak season. Like if you actually go into, KenPom will rank the conferences. And of course that's how do you do that scientifically? That's difficult to rank a group of teams. But if I remember correctly, the Mountain West was actually ranked ahead of the ACC by KenPom.
Okay.
So, it's a bit of a strange year. And then you have a team like Houston that comes out of the American Athletic Conference. And I think they only got 2 bids this year total. But so that's another kind of unusual team, near the top. And so, you get some new blood for the smaller schools. And then I think the blue bloods are kind of going through transitions. And North Carolina's got a new coach. Duke's got a new coach. They struggled a lot of the year. They surged at the end. So it's a strange year, and there's some evidence to show that it's a weak field. So we'll see how that plays out. I have thoughts on that later too.
So I have already filled out 3 brackets. I'm not going to say on air how I filled them out. I of course filled one out that MSU went all the way because I do have to do that every year, or else it's on me if we lose. Can't have that on my shoulders. Do something I was thinking of earlier when you and I decided to record. Do you fill out a bracket? Do you fill out a bracket? And when you fill out a bracket, do you only go by the math, or do you go with your heart too sometimes?
That's a good question. So I think, often I will use the math to sort of guide me. And a lot of times I'll have, because I'll do a couple online brackets just for fun. And usually I do at least one that is almost purely on the mathematical analysis.
Okay.
And then sometimes I'll take that and I'll tweak it in ways. And, because for example, UCLA this year, I think on my last podcast, I picked them somewhat. You guys try to pin me now. I picked them as the national champion. Yeah, but they had a player go down with an ACL injury. And that's unclear how that will affect them. And the math doesn't know that. So, there's certain intangibles you have to sort of try to bake in there. So I'll do that, and, then I'll kind of have some that are fun. But usually I'll at least try to utilize the math to guide me. But then, it's a tool, just like any other tool. It's not the end-all, be-all. You sort of use it to inform your decisions. That's usually what I do. But I'll usually have 2 or 3 different brackets.
Yeah, because I always have one that's kind of like a crazy one. If all different crazy things happen, what would it shake out? And then I do an MSU one, and then I do one that's a little more real. And I just didn't know if you could get past the math and do one that's kind of like, you know what, I'm going to pick one random team and they're going to go super far. They're not supposed to. I don't know if the math would be screaming in the back of your head like, no, no, don't choose that. So I was just curious.
It would cause me a little bit of pain, yes.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, I am who I am after all. I'll say a couple other quick things about just the bracketology experience.
Go ahead.
I did post my my bracket online at a couple different places on Spartans Illustrated as well as on Twitter. So I say I got all but 2 of the teams correct. I got 43 teams seeded properly, including all of the 1 seeds and all the 2 seeds, and 13 of the top 16 seeds. I had 21 teams that were off by 1 seed line, and then only 2 teams that were off by 2 seed lines.
Okay.
I thought Iowa. I didn't have Iowa very high. I had them as a 10, then they went up an 8, and then Iona. Actually, Iona's a 13, which seemed real generous to me.
Okay.
So here's your trivia question, Sydney.
Ooh,
Who is
geez.
Iona's, the Iona Gales? Who is their head coach?
I don't know. I don't know that.
Rick Pitino.
Really?
Yes, 70-year-old Rick Pitino is coaching Iona. And I believe his name is surfaced in a major job, which, I mean, come on, Rick, retire, man. You're 70. Go hang out with your grandkids.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Well, and like, okay, maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else, but didn't he have like a scandal?
Oh, yes. Yeah, he was at, he sort of built his career at Kentucky. I forget how many, he like won a national title there. Then he went to the NBA, I believe, and then wound up at Louisville, which if you know anything about Kentucky or Louisville fans, they don't like each other. So that was real popular in Lexington. It'd be like Tom Izzo going to Ann Arbor, which of course would never happen.
Pandemonium. Yeah.
It would. Yeah. It's like dogs and cats getting along. It's crazy. And yeah, he left Louisville under a cloud of scandal. I believe prostitutes were involved.
That's what I thought. Yeah, I wasn't going to say that. I'm glad you said it. Well, good for him to be back with where is Iona?
I believe
it's Iona, right?
Iona. I believe it's upstate New York, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
But and the metrics are not kind to them. But I do wonder if they got a Rick Pitino bump, because like there's really no reason for them to be where they are. But then at the same time, some people will say that Rick Pitino is one of the best pure basketball coaches alive, or maybe of all time. So, I don't care if you roll out some rec league guys with him. I don't know if I'd want to play a team coached by him. Like, that's a little scary.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out who they drew in the first round, and it's the print on my brackets is a little too small without really leaning over. But somebody's got to play them, and we'll see how that goes, basically. But as far as other bracketology notes, I did actually correctly predict MSU's opponent. MSU will be a 7 seed playing number 10 USC. I also predicted that MSU could potentially be seeing number 2 Marquette in the second round, which at the time was a fairly optimistic draw. And it very much looked like this when I was doing it. And I think this is what happened, is that Michigan State and Northwestern were both 7 seeds. And I think it was a coin toss as to which team gets which opponent. And Northwestern drew Boise State lined up with Texas and playing in Denver. That, to me, looks like a much tougher draw. So I think we definitely dodged a bullet there. Because honestly, MSU's draw looks, for a 7 seed, this is about as good as you can expect. Because if you look at Marquette, they're not a historically strong 2 seed. I think that if you go by Ken Baum, which I do, they're kind of they're the weakest 2. We have Kansas State in the bracket. I got to make sure I'm looking at the correct one, and they're also a fairly weak 3. And then you have Purdue, which, as we say, will do Purdue things. And then Duke and Tennessee is the other top seeds. Like Tennessee, I've talked about them before. I don't believe in Rick Barnes. I don't, and I think they've also got an injury. And then Duke with a first-year coach, sure, why not? So So I mean, they got to win the games, but I don't think we could have asked for a better draw. quite
Well,
honestly.
and I even thought like that location. So Northwestern having to
Yes.
go to Denver and us getting to go, or MSU getting to go to Columbus is like
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, not for Northwestern. Sorry, boo booey, but um, yeah,
Yeah.
I thought that that was fantastic.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that was a coin flip. Because
Hmm.
I think MSU did finish slightly higher than Northwestern in the seed line, and I think most bracketologists had that flipped. So that was,
Hmm.
I think, really razor thin that we could have got sent to Denver.
Well, do
Um,
you think it has anything to do with? Well, probably not, because we had not a good showing in the Big Ten tournament. But Northwestern losing that game to Penn State.
it probably, it might have.
Hmm.
It's really hard to say how much weight they put on those games in the Big Ten tournament. Some people will
Hmm.
tell you they don't matter at all. I think they
Yeah.
must. I mean, it would sort of offend me if they don't take into account all the data, just,
Yeah.
on a personal
Right.
basis.
Right.
It's data. You got to take account of
It's
the data.
data.
What do you
You
do?
have to use it.
That's right. So it's really hard to say how
Yeah.
much impact that made. But I did think the geography part was interesting because I actually
Hmm.
thought there was no chance we were going to go to Columbus
Yeah.
because it just looked like that. Well, I figured if we were tied to Marquette, which is how that works, so you're
Hmm.
geographically tied to the highest seed in your group of four, your pod.
Hmm.
And the way I looked at it, I thought they were going to send Marquette to Des Moines because if I recall correctly on the map, Des Moines is closer to Marquette than
Columbus.
Columbus is. So that was weird. And they wound up sending Texas and Texas A&M to Des Moines. And like
Which is
Texas is not
why.
like that didn't make any sense. Like I would have sent Texas to Orlando because it's like you're going to fly to Des Moines, you're going to fly to Orlando. It's probably easier
Hmm.
to fly to Orlando, and the distance is about the same. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that was one of the weird choices. And then the other one that a lot of people have talked about is they put Houston in the Midwest in
Hmm.
Kansas City, and they sent Kansas to Las Vegas.
Yep.
That does not make sense.
I
Like,
have always wondered, like, I've always wanted to know about who works for the logistics team with this and, like,
mm,
has to figure out all of that stuff. Because that has to be so much planning and work. Like, I just went to Chicago. That was so much planning, and all I
mm,
had to do was take the train from one spot to the other spot. But, like, figuring out what times the games were and all of that. But, like, being on the team that plans the entire bracket and locations and like sets all that stuff up has to be such a huge undertaking because it's so
yeah,
much. Yeah,
yeah, I would
that's a
agree.
topic for another day. But that was something as they were releasing locations that I've always been like, huh, I wonder how they settled on that or why they settled on that from a logistics standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dates and everything are set up well in advance.
Oh, of course.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and then, the committee, I don't think they care so much about the travel. Like, I think those
Hmm.
logistics are often, handled by the universities themselves.
Of
So,
course. Yeah.
yeah, but it's got to be quite a challenge, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you want to break down
Let's
your
dig into the
bracket?
bracket.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So,
So,
yep. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you listed off some points before we started, and you kind of touched on how you do this process. But as far as like as the tournament gets going, how do you continue to kind of like run that process as it goes?
Well, I've developed a pretty um, complicated scheme over the years, but I'll try to
Okay.
kind of break it down into some of the key components. So there's one very interesting aspect of the NCAA tournament that I feel is not understood, but once I figured it out, it sort of like unlocked a lot of the logic of how you think about these problems.
Okay.
Because basically, everyone talks about, in the first round, like the 5-12 upset, like, where's your 5-12
Mm-hmm.
upset? And they, even on the selection committee, they had that curve where it's like, there's, if it's an 8-9 game, it's 50% upset, and then it goes down. But there's actually a very logical reason as to why the data looks like that. And it comes down very simply to the point spread. So if you basically look at the historical point spreads for those different games, it will track exactly with the upset frequency that you see in the NCAA tournament. So, as an example, a 215 upset doesn't happen very often, right? It's happened, I believe, exactly 10 times in history, if I'm looking at the right set of data here. So, that's not very often, but, it does happen. Well, if you look at the average point spread for a 215 game, it's right around 17 or so, which translates into a 95% that the favorite team will win. Well, if you look at the total number of 215 matchups over time, it's basically a little over 120. So like basically the math works out. There's basically been exactly the right number of 215 upsets based on what the point spread would predict. And you can go down the line and, like a 314, it's like 85% and it's dead on based on like, whatever the typical point spread is and like all the way down. So if you know that, you can leverage knowledge of point spreads or systems that help you predict point spreads. And that'll give you, the probability of looking at when upsets happen or not. And so I have a lot of this data, and so I sift through this. And as I mentioned on the last time I was on the show, I like to use KenPom data, KenPom efficiency data, because that's a really easy way to compare to any two teams on a neutral core. You can even correct for home or away, and it'll spit out a pretty good approximation of the point spread. And actually, I ran those numbers this morning. If you take the KenPom prediction and the Vegas prediction for all the first round games, they basically line up. There are some exceptions, but it's almost a perfect straight line. It correlates very, very well. So it's a good tool to use. And so using that, what I then do is I make a spreadsheet, several spreadsheets, and I look at each region. And then you look at, okay, who are the relatively strong and weak seeds in this region relative to an average, say historically average, say 1 seed. And you can sort of see teams that are relatively weak or relatively strong, and that'll give you a hint as to where to expect upsets. So as I was looking through this bracket, at least we'll start with sort of do a real rough, sort of high-level pass. So like the South region, that's where Alabama and Arizona are located. If you actually look at their current KenPom efficiencies, the top 4 seeds in that region are all below average historically. Alabama, Arizona, Baylor, Virginia are all below average teams. San Diego State's average, but I don't know if we can trust their metrics. And then you got Creighton sitting there at a 6 seed that's above average. So that's interesting. So that might be a sleeper team for that bracket.
I just saw something about Creighton, and I don't remember who. Oh, it was the podcast that Hunter Dickinson is on was talking about Creighton being a sleeper or like, a team to watch, which, I usually don't trust anything that comes out of his mouth, but maybe they were onto something.
This data would suggest that. That would tend to favor
interesting.
that. Yep.
Very interesting.
And you can look at like West Virginia could be a sleeper because they're also a relatively strong team relative to a typical 9. And then Utah State at a 10. As I say, the Mountain West teams scare me because I can talk myself into taking a lot of those Mountain West teams really far. And I just don't know if the metrics fully apply to them.
Hasn't
that's
it
troubling.
been a trend, and maybe I'm making this up, but hasn't it been a trend that the Mountain West has consistently gotten a little bit stronger over the past couple years?
I feel that's true, yes.
Okay, yeah. I don't know who said that or where I read it or where I saw it, but I just feel like consistently we've been talking about the Mountain West more. Before, I don't think I ever even heard the name much. But over the past couple of years, I feel like I've heard that conference more and more.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like they've had, San Diego State's been very strong for several years. I'm trying to think, Utah State and Nevada, Boise State. They've made some kind of token appearances here or there in the tournament. I don't know. I can't think of a Mountain West team that's really broken through.
Yeah.
But they've definitely
just been
had
more of a
teams.
part of the conversation. Yeah. Okay, keep going.
Absolutely.
Keep going. On from the Mountain West. Continue.
Okay, on from the Mountain West. That figures in big to the
Yeah,
smile
right.
of this. So if we look at the number 2 overall region is Houston's region, which is let's see, I have some of my old brackets, which are my projected bracket, not the real bracket, so I don't want to confuse myself here. So Houston's bracket, the Midwest. It's pretty good news for Houston because Houston's about an average 1 seed. And they are actually the overall favorite. So you only have to be an average 1 seed to be the overall favorite this year. But the next 5 seeds in their region, so Texas, Xavier, Indiana, Miami, Iowa State, all below average for their seed.
Okay.
You got Texas A&M a little above average. You got Auburn a little above average at the 7 and 9 spot. So that's notable. Although I will note for Houston, actually their 16 seed, Northern Kentucky, is a little bit stronger than usual for a 16. So what does that mean? I don't know. I'm not picking a 16 over a 1, but I think Houston had an injury, as did Virginia in 2018.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Uh,
Um,
Houston has been the talk a lot lately.
yep.
And I watched them play once and I was kind of like, yeah, they're good, but kind of as you
Yeah.
said, they're kind of just like an average team.
Yeah.
I wasn't blown away. I was expecting to turn on the game. Houston's been talked about. Let's watch this. Let's see them blow somebody out. But it was just kind of like, yeah, they played good, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would tend to agree. I think, let's say, it looks like they got a little bit of a soft draw, um, but I don't believe they're gonna. I just don't think I can take them to the Final Four. I
yeah,
just don't believe
yeah.
them.
Okay,
Um,
continue.
so we'll slide down to the West bracket, Kansas's bracket. It does not look good for the Jayhawks.
Mm,
I know at some point I picked them to repeat as the national title, a national champion. They are a severely below average 1 seed. And
hmm
unfortunately for them, UCLA, Gonzaga, UConn, St. Mary's, the next 4 seeds in their region, all above average.
Yeah.
So that does not bode well for the Jayhawks advancing. Um, they probably got the toughest draw of the 1 seeds, which I actually didn't look at those numbers. I can though. And then to the East, as I mentioned, all the seeds are bad, which is nice for us. Purdue, Marquette, Kansas State, all severely below average.
hmm
Tennessee is actually grades out as an above average 4 seed, but
Okay.
again, Rick Barnes, and I think their point guard is injured. Can we really
hmm
believe in them?
Yeah.
So then, Michigan State actually is also a slightly below average 7 seed. What are you going to do? But
Yeah.
you know, they're less below average than most of the other good teams in their bracket. So maybe that'll work out.
That's
We'll see.
good. That's good. A
Yeah,
win,
it's
at least a win at the end
yeah,
of the season. Less below average than the
less
other teams.
below average. Yes, hang a
Uh,
banner.
that's funny.
So that's the overview. And as I
hmm
mentioned, there is some different metrics or ways that you can sort of evaluate the relative strength um, of the brackets. I did that, and as it turned out, MSU is actually in the easiest bracket overall. The
Okay.
East is slightly easier, and the way I do that is not to get into too far the weeds, is to say that if you have a historically average Final Four team, what are their odds to make it through the bracket if I put them in any of the 16 positions and sort of average that? And it's 20%. It's almost 20%, which is pretty
hmm
high. Um, and then if I use the same analysis, the South and the Midwest are about the same, about 17%. The West, too bad. It's so sad to be Kansas because the West is by far the hardest bracket based on this analysis. So yeah, it's going to be tough for them. Um, so some other things that I can do with the math. So that's just the overview, but there's other things like,
hmm
I can actually use the Ken Palm data to fully simulate the tournament and get basically exact odds that any team will advance to, any round you want. And so, as I mentioned, Houston is the favorite. They have about a 17% chance to win the national title. These numbers generally track with the Vegas odds because, we're all really dealing with the same data. So we all kind
Yeah,
of get the
right.
same answer.
Makes
You
sense.
know, Alabama, I think, is number 2 at 14% chance. Um, I've got Purdue has got a 6% chance, as does Tennessee. So, it's not like there's one team that's got like a 50% chance to win the national title. Usually
Right.
even the super strongest historical teams like 2015 Kentucky had like a 35% chance to win, and they didn't
Okay.
win.
Yeah.
So that's how that works. And then as far as MSU's raw odds, I have a 4% chance to make the Final Four.
Woo.
So there's that. And
4 is my lucky number, so that
I,
sounds good to
I
me.
love it. 22% chance to make the Sweet 16, 11% chance for the Elite Eight, the regional final,
hmm
1.3% chance at making the national title game, and I have our title odds at 0.4% right now. That's not great, but it's about the
No.
same odds we had to get a 3 seed in the NCAA tournament or the Big Ten tournament 3 weeks ago, and we almost did it.
hmm hmm
So there we go. So we'll take that.
So, I view March as kind of a magical time where lots of
Mm,
different things are going to happen, and it's kind of like no matter what, any team can step up. Cinderella type stories and all that stuff. That kind of I hold on to that a little bit.
Oh yeah.
How much is that really true when you look at the math of the bracket kind of at the end? How often are there really true Cinderella
Oh.
runs?
I
I
would think,
yeah.
yeah, the way I would answer that question is I think it happens more frequently than you might expect.
Okay.
And I think it's actually somewhat more likely to happen this year. Um,
Okay.
and so the other, I can calculate exact odds, but I also run a series of simulations, which gives me slightly different information. So if we want to know like
Mhm.
how many upsets to expect,
Yeah.
I can start to generate that. And like, is this going to be a more upset laden or chaotic bracket? And the
Mhm.
answer is basically yes. It looks like we are trending in that direction.
Okay.
Um, and you can, and the thing that I think is fun is that you can basically, I can use the simulation tools that I have to basically pretty accurately predict how many upsets you'll see each round.
Okay.
Um, and I'm trying to find the right figure to look at here to tell you that.
I
And
sprung
it's
that
usually,
on you.
oh no, it's okay.
That
I was going to go
question
there.
came out of nowhere. Okay,
I
good.
was going to go there next anywhere.
Good.
Um, and basically, the first round, it's usually about 8.5. And it looks like we're
Okay.
trending more towards around 9 this year.
Okay.
So it looks like, in general, there's going to be about a half more upset per round than usual. Round
Okay.
two is usually about 4.5. We're trending more towards 5 this year.
Mhm.
Um, and then it kind of trails down from there. So the first 3 rounds,
Yeah.
especially, look like they're going to be a little bit more chaotic than usual,
Okay.
basically.
Okay. I
And
like that.
then
The drama of it all.
you got to love it.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of information I sussed out of the data today is,
Mhm.
when a lot of people give their like final four picks, if the talking heads on TV, they'll be like 3 1 seeds and a 2 seed,
Yeah.
or 2 1 seeds and 2 2 seeds, or something like that.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, March is kind of a magical time. You usually expect a Cinderella, and that's because
Mhm.
there often are Cinderellas. And so when I ran through the numbers, I can actually get data on like what the average seed will be for the best Final Four team to the second best, third best, and the weakest Final Four
Mhm.
team.
Mhm.
And this trend is actually pretty consistent. So the top, there's usually always at least one number one seed, but the
Yeah.
second
Of
highest
course.
seed is between a 1 and a 2. So usually you have maybe 2 1 seeds, sometimes only one. That's actually a typical Final Four.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
math says that it's actually trending more towards a 2 seed being the second highest seed in the Final Four this
Okay.
year. Um, that third seed is sometimes like between a 2 or a 3. Looks more like a 3 this year. And the lowest seed in the NCAA tournament, the average is actually 6.
Okay.
So historically, there's very typically one kind of Cinderella outlier in the Final Four.
Mhm.
So I think
Mhm.
we can expect something similar this year. And in fact, as I say, it looks like the math does look for it to be a more chaotic than usual bracket, just barely.
Okay.
Um, but that's not always to be trusted. So
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
um,
You never know. But
you never know. Because at the end of the day, we're just throwing like 28-sided dice or something like that, and that's actually far more true than you might think.
Mm.
So now, if you don't mind, I'll take you
Go
through
ahead.
my upset picks as I look through.
Okay. I
We
love
did
it.
an overview. Now we're gonna dig into um, some of the more specific picks.
Mhm.
So if we look at, we'll sort of go from um, the most obvious, well, not the most obvious, but the most pedestrian one. So the 8-9 games.
Yeah.
If you look
Okay.
at those are usually coin flips. Um,
Mhm.
a good tip there is often to look at the Vegas spread, and you just sort of pick whoever the teams that are favored. If you
Okay.
look at that, it doesn't look great for the Big Ten. Maryland and
Mm.
Iowa are both slight underdogs, and my metrics say to pick against them. So I would take West Virginia and Auburn as
Okay.
9 seeds over those two 8-seeded Big Ten teams.
That's sad because when in doubt, if there's a Big Ten team, I always kind of err on that side just for loyalty's sake. So I maybe will have to take a eraser to my bracket and change
Yeah,
some things.
yeah, and as I say, these are coin flips, but my metrics tell
Yeah.
you that the dice are slightly loaded, and I can tell you which side they're
Mm.
loaded on.
Okay. Okay.
So that'd be that. Illinois against Arkansas is also, I don't have favored there like on the other side. They're a 9, so I don't have them picked as a winner in an 8-9 game.
Okay. Okay.
And then Memphis and Florida Atlantic is kind of right on the bubble. A lot of
Okay.
people, I feel like Memphis is a sexy pick, and I sometimes think it's better to go against a sexy pick. So I actually got Florida Atlantic in that game, which the metrics actually agree
Okay.
with.
Okay.
So the 7-10 games, which is of course very relevant to our interest. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Actually, MSU in USC is shaping up to be a very typical 7-10 match, which means it's just
Okay.
barely better than a coin flip. So MSU is about a 1.5 point favorite. It's like
Scary.
53% odds to
Mm-hmm.
win. We'll try to circle back and talk a little bit about MSU's chances here in a few minutes, but
I should
um,
do a promo. We just, at Spartans Illustrated, put out an article kind of detailing our, opponent, USC. So check that out. Subscribe to read that. I think it was a good article. I didn't know much about USC. I don't know much. I don't pay attention to them much, so it was a good read. So check that out. Subscribe to Spartans Illustrated to kind of read up on who will be playing. Okay,
all
keep
right,
going, Paul.
very good. I'll check that out myself. Um, and so then, but as far as the other 7-10 games, there's two that really stick out. And these do make me slightly nervous because, again, it's the two Mountain West teams. So my
Mm-hmm.
metrics have a strong upset alert for Boise State to take out Northwestern. Again, it looks bad for the
Okay.
Big Ten. It's not looking good. And Utah State over Missouri is like one of the strongest signals that I show. It's like that one's like the top upset that seems likely. But
Yeah.
again, we're relying on the metrics to correctly evaluate the Mountain West teams, which I don't know if I trust.
As you're saying this, all season long they said, the Big Ten is weak. Everyone's kind of like mushed in the middle. It's hard to say who's going to come out. There wasn't a strong leader other than Purdue. But do you think that has played a role in some of this, them being not as likely to win these kind of closer games because that's how the season went?
I don't think so. I think the math just kind of is what it is. And I
Okay.
do think a lot of the Big Ten teams were very closely matched, and they were all kind of, they're sort of all mid, but then that's because the entire country is kind of mid this year.
Yeah,
And so
that
I
is
think
true.
it's just sort of a matchup to matchup situation, and they just kind of
Yeah.
got a little
Okay.
bit of a
Yeah.
tough draw basically. Which I mean, it could work out because again, this is like 55% versus 50. It's like
Right.
a slightly
Right.
better than a coin flip, so it doesn't always go my way. So yeah, so I would take Boise and Utah State. If I look at the 6-11 matchups, honestly, the six seeds are all pretty strong. So I would actually lean towards not taking an 11 seed.
Okay.
We'll see how that goes, but there was no clear answer there. Creighton looks like a strong favorite over NC State, but the other ones are all like really, close to the average. So I wouldn't, that didn't signal anything for me.
Okay. Okay.
So then we get to everyone's favorite, the 5-12. One sticks out, and that's Drake over Miami. That
Okay.
one's the one with the narrowest spread. Ken Palm agrees. That's actually close to 50-50, which a 5-12 game
Really?
should not be. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's 55% that Miami will win, and so that I'll take
Okay.
Drake all day and all night in that in a 5-12.
Where is Drake? Do you know?
Drake is in Iowa. It's a small
Iowa.
school
Okay.
in Iowa.
Okay.
So
All right.
I predict that they will go farther than the Hawkeyes, which I'm sure
Nice.
will make some people happy.
Drake fans flood
Drake
the
fans.
comments. They love Paul.
Smash that like button, Drake fans. Um, and then the other one that's kind of fun is actually Oral Roberts and Duke. So that's
Okay.
the only other 5-12 that sticks out to me as one
Mm-hmm.
that could be problematic. And I think again, Duke is a sexy pick, but first year coach, Oral Roberts is on kind of a hot streak. I
Yeah.
don't know. So take a close look at that. The other two, and again, the other two are St. Mary's and San Diego State, which again, the metrics love those teams. So if you believe that, then they're safe. But
Okay.
there's some uncertainty there.
Yeah.
So then moving on to, so those are kind of where most of the upsets fall, that sort of, the 5 to 8 seeds. If you get higher up, the upsets are unlikely and perhaps
Yeah.
potentially less advisable to take. But, if you were looking to take a flyer, again, I don't know what's going on with the Big Ten teams, because the 13-4 upset is also, a popular one. And Kent State over Indiana is the one that sticks out as being the most likely.
Darn. I'm a
Yeah,
huge Trace Jackson Davis fan. I
I
love the
like
way
him
he
too.
plays.
Me
So
too.
I don't know if I
Yeah,
can believe that, Paul. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that one.
yeah. Well, and the other compelling thing is that Drake and Kent State are both in the same region. They're both in the Midwest, which
Mm-hmm.
would create the somewhat infamous 12 versus 13 matchup so that one of the double digits automatically makes the Sweet 16. So I went ahead and penciled that in my first bracket
Yeah,
because
I
it's
like
like,
that.
that's happened like 10 or 11 times in history, or no, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
slightly more than that. And it for whatever reason it tends to happen. And so if it's going to happen this year, that's the region I like, and I have Drake in the Sweet 16 actually.
Okay. All right.
So
I like that.
so that's a fun one. 314s, I don't see anything obvious there. Those three seeds all look safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then if a, and this is, I shouldn't say this out loud, but I will. If you're going to look
Oh
for a
no.
15 seed,
Mm-hmm.
the most likely 15 seed is Vermont to upset Marquette,
Okay.
which could be nice for us.
Mm-hmm.
So
For sure.
just going to throw that out there. Actually, but I mean that's like 80, that's like 15% chance, which is actually not that bad. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a tighter spread than you'd expect. So
Yeah.
that's one to look at. And again, when you get above the two line, I think I did some amount of math at one point told me never to actually take a three seater or better to lose because it's like unpredictable by nature. But but
Yeah.
sometimes you got to do it
Yeah.
anyway. You just
You
got to
have
do it.
to. Yeah.
You have to. Okay, so then if we move on to other upsets, if I look through my bracket, I already mentioned the first round upset. So then as far as other things that I'll like, and I'll kind of run through these as far as where some
Mm-hmm.
of the metrics show me
Yeah.
leading. And I'll kind of do this region by region. In the South, I actually like San Diego State to upset Virginia. That's a 5-4. And I like Creighton to take out Baylor. As I mentioned,
Okay.
Creighton looks like a sleeper team
Yeah.
in that region. And then perhaps one of the crazier upsets in the second round is I also show Utah State beating Arizona. The math says that that's one of the more
Okay.
likely upset picks in that the two
Mm-hmm.
7 or 10 part of the bracket.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the other weird historical fact is that 10 seeds do surprisingly well against 2 seeds. They have a higher winning percentage against 2 seeds than 7 seeds do for whatever reason.
Hmm.
It's probably a fluke,
Interesting.
but
Yeah.
it is also true. Um,
This
so then
is
I'll just
not based in math, but like, do you think because so a 10 seed upsets a 7 seed, right? They're
mm,
hot, like they're feeling good, like maybe that plays a role in it from the like emotional standpoint, not anything to do with the math. But like I feel like sometimes when there's an upset like that, the next game it's kind of like, oh, they're done. But because they're so hot and they're so high on that win that they shouldn't have had, that sometimes other things kind of ripple effect from that. Maybe not, but just a observation.
that's an interesting point. I guess I can't really speak to the psychology
Yeah,
of how
yeah.
that might work, but yeah, I mean that
Hmm.
certainly could be, and maybe there's something about a 10 seed where like in order to get to a 10 seed, some of those teams have to be like kind of struggled to get into the tournament and are kind of just hitting a hot streak. I mean, I could see
Hmm.
that logic as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I just pulled up the number. 10 seeds are actually 23 and 39 against 2 seeds, which is like 38%. That's pretty
Yeah, that's
high.
pretty good. Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, interesting. So yeah, so then for the rest of the South bracket, I have Alabama versus Creighton in the
Hmm.
regional final, and I actually do have Alabama advancing to the Final Four in
Yeah,
that region.
yeah. Sometimes you gotta.
Yeah, sometimes you gotta take the 1 seed. So then, just shifting over to the Midwest,
Hmm.
again, I have Houston taking out Auburn, and then Drake, as I mentioned, the double digit in the Sweet 16, they don't get past
Hmm.
Houston. Again, Houston's
Yeah,
living the charmed life of having an easy draw.
yeah.
Um, I like Iowa State to take out Xavier, and it's tough. There's Texas A&M plays Penn State. I do have Texas A&M winning. Julius Marble.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
I'll be rooting for him. I like that kid. I'll be rooting for him. But then I have Texas advancing to meet Houston, and I actually have Texas beating Houston. So Against my better judgment, perhaps, I have Texas in the Final Four. They're historically a very poor tournament team, but they don't have Rick Barnes anymore, and they don't have Chris Beard anymore. So maybe that's okay. Maybe they'll figure it out. And somebody's got to beat Houston, and it looks like it's going to be them by default. So that's kind of how it goes. And I know we're going a little bit long, so I'll just kind of.
No, it's okay.
It's okay. Just keep going.
Maybe we can split this episode up into a couple different segments.
Okay.
That's what I've been thinking. So you just keep on going. I like listening. So
okay. So let's move on to the West region, Kansas's region. So here's where things start to get weird. Not that weird, but I do, as I mentioned, I think in the overview, it looks real bad for Kansas. And in fact, it looks so bad that I have Arkansas upsetting them in the second round. So they would be the first one to fall. That's
like that.
Not unusual. I think it's about every other year you see an 8 seed take out a 1, or it should say an 8 or 9. Although, ironically, 8 seeds are much more successful against 1 seeds than 9s, which is also weird. But that's also true. So.
Yeah.
Who knows why? But I have Arkansas taking out Kansas, and then I have UConn defeating St. Mary's to set up that Sweet 16 matchup. And then I've got a little bit of chalk in the bottom of the bracket. I have Gonzaga and UCLA meeting at the bottom.
Okay.
From there, I have UConn defeating UCLA. So I have UCLA beating Gonzaga, UConn winning, and then I actually have number 4 seed UConn coming out of the West. That's sort of a sleeper pick there. It's a 4 seed. It's the type of year where that sort of thing should happen. I'll also point out UConn is kind of a funny team to figure out because their metrics are super, super good. And I know they've kind of been up and down. But I think I mentioned in the last episode I was on, there are certain metrics that are very consistent for potential national champions. And one of them is being in the top 6 of KenPom. And I believe that UConn is actually number 4, despite being a 4 seed. I should also mention Texas. The other team I just took is number 6, and Alabama is number 3 in KenPom. So the 3 Final Four teams I've mentioned are all in the top 6 of KenPom, which I just realized just now.
Okay.
So that's what I got there, and then we'll end up in the East, the region near and dear to our hearts as Spartan fans.
Of course.
I mentioned I have Purdue against Florida Atlantic. I have Purdue winning that. Maybe. Probably. We'll see. And then I have Tennessee upsetting. Well, no, this is counterintuitive. I think a lot of people have picked Duke. Tennessee is the higher seed. Tennessee, as I say, I think has some injuries, so I assume that they would be an underdog, even though they're the higher seed. I'm going to take Tennessee anyway. Why not? Chaos. So Tennessee's metrics are actually also very good. I can't pick them to go much farther than that. Because they're number 5 in KenPom. But, I'll take them to Sweet 16. Then I have Kentucky against Kansas State. That's chalk. I actually have Kentucky upsetting Kansas State. And I think I might. Well, no, I'll go ahead and say. And then I'm going to go homer pick. I'm going to take MSU over USC and Marquette to go to the Sweet 16.
Of course, as you should.
I'm just going to do that.
If you would have said anything different, we would have ended the call. You would have been off. But,
I would have been banned for life.
Excommunicated.
Yeah. So I feel like a Sweet 16 might be the ceiling for this team. I'm hoping for better, and even that might be optimistic as a 7. You can't hope for that, but that's what feels right.
Yeah.
And so then I have, as I say, I can't. This would leave me with another. There's a lot of SEC teams here, which makes me uncomfortable. But what are you going to do? That leaves me with a Kentucky-Tennessee regional final, which is not ideal, but I do have Kentucky winning that. So just for fun, we'll put 6 seed Kentucky in the Final Four with then another SEC matchup with Alabama. That's not great. With Texas and UConn. And then the way I mapped it out, I'll take Bama and UConn, and I will actually take UConn, at least for today, as your 2023 national champion.
Nice.
So, the math most of those picks I did use the math that I laid out where you kind of look at the relative strength and weakness of the teams based on KenPom. I did take a little license towards the end because sometimes it just gets a little boring. And I have to throw a little spice in there. But
mix it up. Yeah.
But that is generally the methodology that I use.
Okay. Well, if you haven't filled out your bracket yet, now you know exactly how to do it. Paul's always right. So, fill it out just like that. So, something I wanted to just bring up something that you brought up in the last podcast that I thought was cool. You have every bracket that you've ever filled out since what year?
Well,
sorry, this is not something we talked about beforehand.
It is not, but I came prepared. So yes, I did mention I have the literal elementary school laminated folder with my name on it, which might be backwards. And I was just looking through this, and the oldest one that I have in here is a hand-drawn bracket from 1991, folks.
Wow. You should laminate those to make sure that they never get ruined.
Yeah, they're getting a little. They're getting a little faded. At some point, I started printing them, like make them a little Excel template. So I made some. But, yeah, that was 2016.
I have a laminator, Paul. Drop them those off at my house. I'll fix them up for you. Then you'll have those as a family heirloom to pass down.
Oh, that's great. Usually my children just complain when I watch basketball. It's very sad. I don't understand where they came from.
Oh, no. Oh, got to turn that around quick.
Yeah.
Don't want that to get out of hand. Yeah.
No, I'm concerned.
So I think maybe this would be a good point to stop this discussion. We'll end this episode here, and then, we'll come out with another episode, maybe something shorter to talk about, maybe in depth about MSU a little bit more. And I know you have some stuff that you want to talk about as far as Purdue, some more in-depth stuff that you mentioned.
Well, my only comment on Purdue is that, I did have them going out to Tennessee, and I haven't looked at Tennessee's roster, but, I feel, I don't think I've quite mentioned this before. I feel like I can see exactly how their season ends, and why I don't believe in them other than their innate Purdue-ness, which is that they have young guards, and that usually does not translate well to success in the tournament. And, they have Edey, who's very good, but usually big men don't usually carry teams in March. They just don't. And so I think he's going to get in foul trouble, as he has in a couple of games later in the Big Ten season. And the young guards I don't want to say they're going to crumble, but I think they're going to make mistakes. And I think that's going to lead to them leaving the tournament far sooner than Boiler fans expect. So I did take them to Sweet 16.
That was something that the Purdue fans that were sitting behind us in Chicago were mentioning. They were really quite low on Foster Loyer. They really thought he needs more time. They really didn't like him, which is not something that I had heard before.
Yeah.
And so as I was watching him, he's a freshman. I mean, he plays like a freshman. He's young. What are you going to do? He's a good player, but he's young. And then something else that they kept talking about was if you watch Zach Edey play, there are so many shots that he should be making just because he's 7'4", that he misses. And then those opportunities are going to start to add up in the tournament. That's kind of what those guys were saying. And as I was watching him, it's literally like a tip into the basket, and he's missing, and he's, not able to get the rebound because he doesn't quite have, there's a little bit of uncoordination there sometimes with him. Sometimes he's on and he's, the player that everyone says that he is. But as I was watching them and listening to those Purdue fans, there are times where he's making mistakes because he's newer to basketball. He's been developed by Matt Painter, and I think there's more development that Matt could do with him. There's room for growth there. But I think they're going to get out of the Big Ten, and they're going to find that those problems, just like you mentioned, are going to add up, and it's not going to go well for them. So now I had a new insight into Purdue that I didn't have before. And I just thought that was very interesting heading into, important games.
Yeah. No, I think that all makes sense.
Okay, so we're going to end this episode here, and then we'll talk about MSU a little bit more specifically in a little bit of a shorter episode next. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks, everyone.